The focus of much of the debate this week is on the economic cost of Brexit. Jonathan Portes is the co-author of one recent economic analysis. He's a professor of economics at King's College London and a senior fellow at the organization UK in a Changing Europe. It seems widely accepted now that Brexit, no matter what form it takes, is going to make Britons poorer. I know that we're looking at a range here, but help me understand what the price actually might be.
Well, we had a report yesterday from the government's own economists, and we also had two reports, one by me and some colleagues at the London School of Economics, and one by another independent research institute. And interestingly, they all come to pretty much the same sort of conclusion. So all these reports look at a spectrum of possible Brexit deals, ranging between what would happen if we simply remained in the EU, what would happen if we took the deal, Theresa May's Brexit deal, and what would happen if we crashed out of the EU without a deal at all. And we all agree that, as you say, Brexit will make us poorer. A no-deal Brexit would be considerably worse. So a no-deal, a chaotic Brexit, could, in the long run, cost the UK perhaps 8 or 10% of GDP. So maybe close on a tenth of our national output over a long period of time. That's quite a big price tag. As for Theresa May's version of Brexit, which would still leave us in a free trade area with the EU in the long term, and possibly in a customs union, at least for some period, but would still introduce some new trade barriers with the EU. So our estimate, for example, is that would cost us between 2 and 5.5% of GDP. And in terms of GDP per capita, that would be between £600 and £1,700 a year per person.
Is there, I mean, in your assessment, is there an economic advantage to Brexit?
Well, there are specific aspects of Brexit which might be an economic advantage. So in theory, Brexit might make it easier for the UK to do trade deals with some third countries, like the US, for example. That's speculative, but it might well be the case. However, there's no way that the economic pluses of free trade deals with third countries like the US or China, even if they do eventually materialize, which is a long way off, there's no way that that will outweigh the losses that result from new trade barriers with the EU, which is, of course, by far our largest trading partner.
As people now look at these reports and this economic assessment, how different is the discussion now about the cost of Brexit than the kinds of conversations and debates that Britons were having 2 years ago leading up to the referendum?
Well, I mean, some things have changed and some things have stayed the same. I don't think there was ever any real doubt among economists 2 years ago, any more there is now, that Brexit on the whole will make us somewhat poorer. Probably not under most scenarios catastrophically so, but it will do some economic damage. And I think people who voted leave, for the most part, either did so because they think that there is the political advantages of Brexit, the concerns around democracy or sovereignty or reducing immigration or what have you, outweigh those economic downsides. Some people thought that, and other people, difficult as this may be for people like me to understand, other people just don't trust economists. And to be fair, that's not a crazy position. There's a lot of uncertainty in these forecasts. They do represent a consensus among credible professional economists, but there is a lot of uncertainty, and it might be worse than we think, or it might be better than we think. So I think many of these arguments are simply the same ones we've been having for quite a while. I think perhaps what's changed a bit is it is much more. First of all, it's much more immediate. The choices that have to be made are much more immediate. And second, that some, at least, of what was promised on the Leave side, at least during the campaign, has been shown to be fantasy. The idea that we could somehow leave the EU, end freedom of movement, restrict immigration, and yet remain in the EU single market and have no trade barriers with the EU. That was always a fantasy, but some people at least believed it, and now they no longer can, because it's clearly not going to happen. Equally, some people believed that we were somehow going to get £350 million extra for the NHS, as the Leave campaign put on the side of their bus. Everybody at the time who knew anything about how the public finances work said this was simply a lie, and we all know it's a lie, I hope now. But some people at least believe that.
Is this the profusion of cakeism that you lament in some of your writing?
That's right. There is, the view that the EU would be happy to let us have all the things we wanted out of membership without the obligations, the other responsibilities, or being subject to the sort of legal and regulatory and political apparatus of the EU, like the European Court of Justice. This was that is precisely what we mean by cakeism. And I think what has changed in the last couple of years, where the debate has become more focused and more realistic, is that I think people on all sides, Leave or Remain, and there are people on the Remain side who are guilty of cakeism too, it has to be said. All sides are realizing that is not an option.
I also want to ask you about the idea of political control, because that's, I mean, on the sort of philosophical side, that was a big part of the argument, and recognizing, I mean, that's always a balancing act, right? Is it a price worth paying for that kind of political control? You've suggested this deal is anything but control. In what way?
Well, I mean, the key element of the deal, and this is, I think, the legitimate objection that many of the anti-deal Brexiteers in the Conservative Party have, is that we have, in order to ensure that there is no hard border on the island of Ireland, we have been obliged to say that the UK will remain effectively in a customs union with the EU unless and until some other as yet identified solution can be found for the Irish border question. Well, what does remaining in a customs union with the EU mean? It means that we have to apply the EU's common external tariff. That is a tariff, we have to effectively implement the EU's trade policy. And while at the moment we certainly don't have control over what EU tariffs ought to be, at least we have a vote. In this new arrangement, we won't even have a vote. The EU will set tariffs and we will have to apply them and collect them. And that situation could go on indefinitely. And it's hard to describe that as in any sense taking back control.
And no deal?
Well, under no deal, we will, I guess, have control, but in the short term, the disruptive impact of a no deal will be very, very severe indeed. And I think, one of the reasons that you actually have some people in the cabinet who were strong supporters of Brexit, who are still remaining in the cabinet and don't any longer think no deal is an option, that they've been exposed to the reality of what actually no deal is likely to mean for British industry, for British business, for supply chain, for supplies of things like medicines and so on. And while I don't personally think that some of the apocalyptic scenarios that some people are talking about will come to pass, I think the government will be able to avert those. It will undoubtedly be quite disruptive and quite damaging economically. And again, the reports that came out yesterday certainly showed that.
I know. I mean, economics is obviously is your expertise, but I also want to ask you about the cost of the political disruption that you're seeing as well.
Well, that's I mean, there are a number of aspects to that. Certainly, the UK is in a state of political flux, and it is very difficult to know, to predict what will happen politically over the next few months. Of course, political chaos doesn't necessarily translate into bad outcomes for the population. Some countries, Belgium is often cited. Belgium recently went over a year without a government, and actually life carried on pretty much as normal. Indeed, the economy did okay. So it's not necessarily the case that political chaos affects the lives of the population. But I think as a policy person and a former civil servant, what I do observe is that one, whether you're a Leaver or a Remainer, one thing you can't deny is that Brexit has sort of sucked the life out of other policy debates. It's taking up so much bandwidth, as we say in Whitehall and Westminster, that if you actually think that the fundamental problems with the UK that the UK should be worried about aren't much to do with the EU either way. They're things like skills, education, training, inequality, regional disparities, all of these issues. Any serious attempt to make policy to address those has really gone out the window because the entire political class is currently only focused on Brexit.
I thank you very much for your expertise on this.
No problem.